Well, welcome everyone, and particularly welcome to you, Michael Graham.
Thank you.
Thanks for giving us some of your time. This is officially a week off for you.
Yes,
So,
a week off and quite an intense job. We have, in the work that I do, you have to be quite kind of deliberate about taking the time off that you have. So yeah, I've made sure I've done that this week.
okay. So, well, thanks for your time, particularly as it is
No,
your
no
time
problem.
off you're giving to us. But, Michael, we're going to talk a bit about social care, particularly in the UK. The
Yeah,
have implications outside, but that's your situation.
yeah,
Um, I think you live obviously in the UK, in England, I believe.
yeah.
Give us a little bit of background to what you do. I don't know whether you've got a job title, but what your work is.
Sure.
Just tell us a little bit about that.
Absolutely. So I am a social worker. Uh, People probably get all kinds of images in their head when you say the term social worker. A lot of people associate it with people coming and taking other people's children away.
Mhm.
Uh,
Yeah.
that's not a good reflection of what social workers do to start with. But also, I work with adults, so I don't have anything to do with child protection or safeguarding or anything like that. I've worked in social care probably since my early 20s. I'm in my mid 30s now. And first of all, as a care worker, I worked
Yeah.
in care homes and did kind of community work with people who had disabilities. And then I did my social work training about 5, 6 years ago and got a master's in social work. Became a qualified social worker and been working as a social worker since then with adults with disabilities again.
Okay.
So what I work for a local authority, so a council,
Yep.
it's kind of in common parlance, in a department that supports people with all kinds of disabilities.
Tell me, Michael, why, or is there something that led you into that? Led might be a bit of a strong word,
Um,
but what drew you in
I
that direction? That you
it was possibly accidental. I mean, you depending on your perspective, you might see it as God's guidance.
uh-huh.
Um, I was originally interested in developing a career in arts. I did my first degree in dance and performing arts, and was kind of very much as kind of part of the church background that I was in, kind of charismatic church, looking at kind of what doing worship differently meant.
Okay.
Very much part of that and was drawn into doing arts and expressive sort of things kind of in my very, very early 20s. And then I'm also of that generation that kind of had to readjust when we had the financial crash in
Sure.
2008. So ended up in care work, and then moving into social work felt like a good progression from there. It's better paid, one thing.
That's good reason.
But also I had a friend of mine from the church that I was going to at the time, who is now also quite a influential social worker in her own right, who kind of had a conversation with me one day saying, listen, Mike, dance performing arts isn't working out for you at the moment. It's not taking you anywhere, which it wasn't. This could work for you quite well. You'd be quite suited to this. And I hadn't thought about social work at all.
Okay.
I had the same kind of preconceptions as a lot of people might have about social work and thought, that can't be for me. But then just decided to kind of give it a try.
Give it a go. Yeah, very good.
Just it's made as I've gone through the training and got to understand it and work in it, it's made more and more sense for me.
Really. Now, I know that we didn't connect directly, but you connected with some posts I wrote, which caught
Yes.
my attention because I could tell by what you wrote that you had a bit of a passion.
Mm,
And that really is what I want to explore, passion about social care.
mm,
Now, from my school background, the depth of my education, I do know that when there's a shift from Catholicism to Protestantism. The monasteries are closed down, et cetera, et cetera. The monasteries very much were positioned in society to exercise, I might not be using the right term here, but social care, and obviously to exercise it on behalf of the church. Now, when
Yeah.
that happened, so if I take you back there, could you give me, and for the sake of those watching, a little bit of the history? How does social care develop from there? You know, because that's a significant move, and I guess a vacuum was left. I don't know how you explain that, but so from 1500s.
Yeah, around about there. I'm not there's going to be all kinds of people who might be on kind of watching this video who might correct me. I'm not going to say everything kind of perfectly correct.
No, no worries.
So I'm also drawing very heavily on a particular book called Community Care and the Law, which is a book about that size.
Okay.
About all the aspects of social work law for adults. But the introduction to that book is very interestingly well written, and goes through the kind of development of social care in the UK in a really interesting way. So yeah, so we have Henry VIII, who kind of establishes Protestantism as the state religion in a move away from Catholicism, but then has a problem because he wants to get rid of the monasteries as a powerful kind of expression of influence of the Pope and the Catholic Church in the UK, and gets rid of them in quite a kind of violent, in many ways, way. But then is left with a conundrum because they supported a lot of poor people. The term poor is used right the way up to kind of maybe around about 100 years ago as a kind of catch-all term for everybody, both who might be kind of financially poor, but also disabled or unwell or experiencing mental health issues, all kinds of different things are kind of caught in this term poor. But yeah, the monasteries were looking after the poor. So they, Henry VIII develops a kind of very embryonic sort of arrangement where local taxes are paid to parish churches.
Okay.
Or parish kind of council organisations, and those individual parishes, so quite small units of population and geography, get given responsibility for all of the poor people in their area. And there isn't what's really interesting is that there isn't a precondition. The only condition that there is to kind of benefit from this support that the parishes are providing is that you live in their area. That's it. You don't have to do any. It's really kind of universal in that sense. If you have a need, the parish will provide for it.
Can I just jump in just real quick?
Yeah.
So in the shift, does the book cover this? But does the level of care continue? Does it decrease? Is it more effective, less effective, or no perceptible change?
I'm not aware of a kind of sense of it becoming more or less effective from monasteries to the parishes. I think there's probably a culture of the way that people are cared for that just continues in many ways, just under just a Protestant form, and with maybe within a different structure. I think there's a shift from the extent that you don't have to go and find a monastery.
Okay.
Get the support you need. It's in your local.
Yeah, but it's still it's a church activity. But
it's a church activity.
So
yeah.
When does the kind of the church activity when does that come to a shift and a change? When would that be?
Well, let's before we get to that.
Okay.
What we see, it's not just a church activity. So it's not so much. I mean, the church is the church are receiving the taxes are raised,
Yeah.
the church are receiving those taxes and using the taxes to provide the care. They're kind of the local authority or the council at the time. They're the ones who are providing it. So it is a church activity in a sense, but it's not a church activity in the sense that we might understand churches doing things as charitable organizations.
Okay.
It's tax. It's everybody has to pay the tax, and it's very much a kind of an extension of government in that sense.
Okay.
And this puts this kind of system in a place to grow, and it really grows over the next kind of few hundred years, to really cover a large section of the population, and it kind of becomes the most comprehensive and universal way of looking after poor people in Europe. And Europe's going through this kind of time where it's transitioning through Protestantism into the Enlightenment and looking at kind of people's rights and that sort of thing. And in terms of caring for people, Britain is leading the way with this system, in terms of the amount of care that it's providing, and also just the accessibility that everybody has to it. They don't have to do anything to get access. They just turn up to the people who are locally providing this thing and they get it. There is then a transition. This is seen as, it's quite expensive in some ways. There's a lot of tax that's needed in order to provide this system. And so you then have a transition in the kind of 1800s towards the idea of the deserving and the undeserving poor.
Okay.
And you have a kind of a shift in, you have some lobbyings by people, some people within the church, some kind of Christian thinkers who start thinking about things like population, and start thinking that, well, you have the Industrial Revolution, the kind of lots of people going into cities and that sort of thing, and people start to worry that cities are getting overpopulated and think that that needs to be controlled. If you're providing poor people with lots of support, that is also holding the population in a particular place. So there's a criticism of the system as it was, and a kind of transition through legal means into what we have is the poorhouse system.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the poorhouse system is very much, if you it's kind of framed in an economic and financial sense. If you get into debt, you get, or if you commit a crime of some particular type, you get sentenced, and you get sent to the poorhouse. And the poorhouse is where you work and receive support at the same time. So you're
give us a little sort of window into what era are you talking about?
So we're talking about the kind of 1800s onwards, through the kind of Victorian period.
Classic pictures of the Victorian.
Yeah. You've got this is very kind of the sort of stuff that Dickens was really. If you think about Dickens and his reflections of the poorhouse, it's very much that. But it was seen as a way for you had this transition away from an idea of let's just look after everybody, to some people deserve to be looked after, the deserving poor, and some people don't deserve to be looked after, they're the undeserving poor. Now, the deserving poor get charity from wealthy people who want to give. The undeserving poor don't get anything, and they're sent to the poorhouse. And they get saddled with debt. And they get saddled with even more debt in the poorhouse, so that you can end up in the poorhouse for the rest of your life because of all kinds of things that happens. So there's this big shift that happens with the way that poor people are cared for and provided for. But and that shift comes along with a certain sense of, as you say, a different, without giving it a value judgment, a different sense of morality.
Yeah.
That what we shouldn't be doing is, as a society and as a nation, is encouraging people into particular things that we see as sinful or wrong or morally faulty. And so we try and discourage people from doing those things by not supporting them and saying, well, if you do those things, you're on your own. And we try and encourage poor people to do more virtuous things by showing them charity where they display behaviors that we like. So if you're not alcoholic, if you're not using things like prostitution to get money, if you're not stealing, that sort of thing, many of the things that poor people were actually doing in order to make ends meet were kind of put as kind of being morally deficient. So yeah, there's that dynamic kind of set up.
Can I pull
yeah,
you,
carry on.
Yeah, no, can I pull you a little closer to our day?
Yeah.
The Second World War era, and obviously post that, is a very significant time of shift. Talk a little bit about that. What shifts then in terms of social care?
So we have this this idea of the deserving, the undeserving poor run right up to around a kind of the early 1900s.
Okay.
There's some kind of some religious and some kind of philosophical or political work that's done, some ideas that are kind of emerging, but then the Second World War is really I mean, it's a war, but it's also a political event that changes the way that it gives the United Kingdom an opportunity to start afresh. And there's some very detailed thinking that goes into, and also cross-party thinking between different political factions to kind of gain a consensus about what they want. And so we have the setting up of the welfare state alongside the NHS. And that brings in a bunch of things, including kind of welfare benefits and that sort of thing. And the NHS that look after two sides of things like pensions and benefits if you're disabled and that sort of thing. And then also the NHS giving you free healthcare. So that kind of looks after two significant groups of people who would have been considered to be the poor. And then we also see, in terms of social care as it is now, we see a kind of gradual construction of social services departments, and the responsibility for supporting disabled and elderly people who need support is really put into the hands of again, local authorities, councils, as they are made into, and they eventually councils are given the opportunity to raise council taxes. So again, it goes back to this kind of local area institutions raising taxes from the local area to provide support for local people. So you have that set up, and that kind of setup evolves alongside the welfare state in the NHS through to round about the 80s. And then in the 80s, we get another shift, and it kind of, so I think through the 60s and 70s, there's been quite a kind of emphasis on universalism again, at the point of access. You don't have to do anything in order to get what you need. In the 80s, we have Margaret Thatcher coming as Prime Minister. This is happening just as I'm born, in the kind of early mid-80s, and a much more an emphasis again on this idea of it's a similar kind of dialogue or discourse to the deserving and the undeserving poor, and an emphasis on work. What we want to do is get people into work. Work is good. And there's a reduction in what's known as the social safety net. So a reduction in things like benefits and that sort of thing, but also a kind of very much a cutting of budgets of social services departments. And also the introduction of the poll tax, which eventually becomes the council tax, that kind of gives local authorities much more responsibility to manage their finances for themselves, and to raise the money, but it also puts the responsibility onto them rather than central government for doing that. So the risks and the responsibilities are kind of pushed away from central government, and what Margaret Thatcher is doing is kind of getting central government to kind of step back a bit and take less responsibility. What we also see, there is also then a kind of continuity through that process into the 90s and New Labour. What Labour do in some ways is very much within the same frame of thinking as what Margaret Thatcher did. They bring in market economics into the social care system, where local councils were employing carers themselves and setting up things like daycare centres and care homes and respite homes and that sort of thing. It was all run by the council. What New Labour do in the 90s is break that up and say, well, what we're going to do is we're going to marketise all this and see all these things as services. So now what the council becomes is a body that is a commissioner of services. It pays for services, but it doesn't actually provide those themselves. Those are provided by private companies and charities. So that's pretty much how we arrive at the system that we're at today.
We're going to come for a second bite of the apple, as it were, a second interview in a minute. But I want to just close with a small question. It probably hasn't got a small answer because it's a huge subject. The austerity. So austerity kicks in, obviously in a big way, post 2008 and etc. And that brings us kind of up to date. How does that affect things?
So councils get their budget cut by around about 50% of the resources that they used to have. That's not necessarily a cut of 50% of the money, but there's a kind of loss of round about that amount in terms of resources. What that means is that council services and services for people who have disabilities, and also for children's services as well. Before, in the kind of early mid-noughties, councils and indeed the NHS as well was doing a lot of preventative services. We were kind of putting a lot of energy into trying helping people to be as independent as possible by supporting them to be that way. And then the kind of tide comes in on that. We pull back from doing quite a lot of community-based work and work that is more kind of more there to help people in a kind of day-to-day basis to do things that they like to do rather than do things that they absolutely need to do. But that is supporting people to do those things is very much supportive of their mental health, their well-being, so that they're less likely to deteriorate in whatever condition they have and end up needing more support because of a deterioration of some form, or just falling onto kind of harder circumstances. So what we end up with now through the 2010s and here we are now in the 2020s is very much a service of last resort. We become a crisis service. We provide very much only the essentials as far as possible. We are still very much working on instead of this kind of deserving, undeserving, moralistic thing, we still have a process to determine whether people are in or out of the social care system, but it's done through something called assessment and criteria that are laid out in the law, in the Care Act in this case. But it's still very much of, do we see you as someone who should be accessing our services based on some criteria that we have defined? Are you in, are you out? Once you're in, we then look at, I mean, you don't get everything, but then we look at what is reasonable in terms of what we should provide. And we have to be very careful about our budgets and how much we spend. So there's an emphasis on kind of spending as little as possible. Yeah, so that's very much where we're at.
Yeah, Michael, thanks for the kind of thumbnail sketch. I know that there's much more that you could fill in between.
Oh yeah.
Every sentence, but thanks, and we'll come back to you in a couple of minutes' time, and we'll carry on the conversation. So until then, thank you.
Great, thank you.